Welcome to all to the first of the special six-part lecture series, Women's Agency During Nazism. It gives me great pleasure to see a number of academics, friends from around the world, and even some of our survivors. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Heather Blumenthal, and I'm the Executive Director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center. The Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Durban Holocaust and Genocide Centers serve as a place of memory for all those who perished under the Nazi regime, as well as other genocides. We strive to work towards creating a more caring and just society in which human rights and diversity are respected and valued. And it is in this ethos, and this ethos is in the very DNA of each center. Working together and collaborating under the umbrella of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, we are able to further espouse the morals and values that I had mentioned previously. In January of this year, I and Andrea, our Austrian intern, had met with Ambassador Johann Briger of the Austrian Embassy, Pretoria, with the idea of developing and collaborating on a project between the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation and the Austrian Embassy. We had previously, in 2019, collaborated on the successful Mona Golubic Children of Willesden Lane concert, in which 10,000 learners had the privilege of attending Mona's performances both in Cape Town and Johannesburg, and therefore Dr. Briger knew exactly what we were capable of doing. After much discussion, the ambassador agreed to have not one, but 6 lectures specifically developed under the title of Women's Agency During Nazism. There was, however, one condition, and that was that we were to include in certain of the lectures women's agency during apartheid or in Africa. This has been a mammoth and exciting project to work on, and I would like to thank my colleagues Tali and Mary Klug, the executive directors of the Johannesburg and Durban Holocaust and Genocide Centers, for their generous input and guidance, as well as Andrea and Justine Sibomani for their organizational and creative skills and the many hours they spent behind the scenes to really make this happen. And of course, without our technical team behind the scenes, this wouldn't be happening. I would also like to extend a warm and grateful thank you to Ambassador Johann Briger and the Austrian Embassy of Pretoria for their generosity and support. The theme of tonight's first panel discussion is Rethinking Women's Narratives, and Tali, the Executive Director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, as well as Chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, will be moderating the session. Please remember that during the panel discussion, your cameras and audio will be switched off, and if you have any questions or comments, to please write them up in the Q&A or the chat section at the bottom of your screen. It is now my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Johann Briger of the Austrian Embassy of Pretoria to say a few words.
Dear Heather, good evening to everybody, or good day. I cannot be with you physically in South Africa in these testing times that we see again, but that's what COVID made possible, that we're all meeting in virtual platforms, virtual rooms these days, and from even a continent away. I'm very, very happy to be with you. I did not want to miss really the start of the series that has become about, as Heather mentioned, it originated in a casual meeting early this year in Cape Town, when we sat down, Heather, Andrea, the Austrian intern at the center, and said, listen, why don't we use the time that we're privileged to have young, brilliant minds, also from Austria, joining forces with friends at the Holocaust centers in South Africa to do something together. And as Heather said, fantastic, really a fantastic program has come out of that. You'll know that we cannot do enough to look into the different aspects of these dark moments in history. And we tried to play our small role in that to assist and cater for that. And I think the work that has been done to a large extent by the Cape Town Holocaust Center, but also with strong support by the Johannesburg Center and also the Durban Center. I think this is just a wonderful project that has come to fruition and starts today. It's 6 series coming up. They're all looking into different facets of women's roles and the narratives around that. And I'm very happy that my request in looking also in some comparison of what happened during women or during the apartheid in South Africa, by women, to women, which role did they play, whether there is anything that looks similar, which I'm pretty sure of these discussions will bring about. But this evening is not only in thanking the 3 centers that we work closely with. I had the privilege and pleasure to meet all 3 strong ladies, Heather, Mary, and Tali, personally with their teams in the recent past. Always a pleasure, and we always have great ideas that come about. Heather also mentioned the wonderful project that we did, or the embassy just contributed a small part in what was a major project with Mona Golabek and her stage production, looking into the life of her mother, Lisa Jura, who was on the children's train to Williston Lane. And she connected with more than 10,000 children during the period. And we also managed to bring her to Harare at the time, which really left behind very strong memories. And, on that, I'm sure we will also continue after this series, which I guess will also produce some new insights of and new perspectives on what was happening and what we thought knew so far. I'm very grateful looking at the names of panelists. It's really the best experts you probably could find in the different areas. Some of them I know personally, and I can only congratulate you on that. I'm very much looking forward to these discussions. And I'm also happy, maybe on the last remark before you start the seminar tonight, I'm also happy to know or have noticed that some new Austrians have changed, have come on board. We have had the chance to open up the Austrian citizenship to the descendants of refugees that had to leave Austria during Nazi time. We had about 80 applications coming out of South Africa. 40 of them have already been decided positively and have been awarded their citizenship. I know that some of them are online. So a very warm welcome to you as well, and a lot of success and interesting discussions during the series. Thank you very much for having us, being a partner in that important task. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Tali. And thank you, Mary, with your teams. It's wonderful working with you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Briger, for your comments, for opening this series officially. And it is indeed my pleasure to be the moderator of today's first session in the 6-part series about women's agency during Nazism, and may I say, and beyond, in South Africa and Africa. And I am, for those that don't know me, Tali. I'm the director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. You can see a glimpse in the background behind me, the lobby of the center. And I'm also honored to be the chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. This 6-part series that will look at many, many areas, through art, through theater, through song, through research and academia at different aspects of women's narratives during the Nazi period, but also, as I said, in Africa and South Africa. And we will look at women's roles in those narratives. And today we are starting by rethinking women's narratives with fantastic, fantastic panel. First on our panel will be Professor Andrea Peto, who I know very, very well because we are partners for the last many months in writing and recording podcast series with colleagues from other universities called Sleepwalking Through the Assault on Democracy. And I really invite all of you to look at our SoundCloud and listen to some of those podcasts that are looking at, amongst other things, at dangerous women. And indeed, those issues of women perpetrators or collaborators will come also in today's panel. Our 3 centers in South Africa focus on women in a large extent in our exhibitions, in our educational programs. For example, a conscious curatorial decision for us at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center was to ensure that women's voices are included throughout the exhibition. And not only as victims, but or survivors, but also as bystanders, as resistors, as rescuers, or as perpetrators. And as I said, Andrea Peto and Sara Brown on our panel will look at some of those role models and in today's panel. For example, in our exhibition, we tell the story of Agnes, a survivor of rape during the genocide in Rwanda, whose entire family was murdered. And why do we do that? Because it is crucial to include these stories specifically in South Africa, as according to the South African Police Service's statistics on sexual and gender-based violence, which always is underreported by at least 10 to 20 times, South Africa can be compared to states in armed conflict. This is scary, scary statistics, which force us to really introduce women voices into all that we do. So we meet Holocaust survivors, for example, Veronica Phillips, who passed away sadly this February. And we learn about her experience in the ghetto of Budapest, in the camps. We have her childhood doll that was left with her mother in Budapest when she was taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Or we learn about upstanders in both Rwanda and in the Holocaust. So in today's panel, we will dive into this subject much more. And we will learn about women as leaders in resistance, as perpetrators, as victims, as survivors. And the panelists will introduce us to their extensive research and provide a multi-perspective approach to the topic. They will do that in only 15 minutes, which is a huge task for each one of them. I will start by introducing, as I said, my friend and colleague for many, many months, Professor Andrea Peto, who is a historian and professor at the Department of Gender Studies at Central European University, Vienna. Her works on gender, politics, Holocaust, and war have been translated into 23 languages. Recent publications include The Women of the Arrow Cross Party, Invisible Hungarian Perpetrators in the Second World War, published in 2020 by Palgrave Macmillan, and Forgotten Massacre, Budapest, 1944, by the Greater in 2021. Andrea, the floor is yours. When Andrea ends her 15 minutes presentation, I will introduce you to Sara Brown, and we will continue with the panel. Andrea, the Zoom floor.
Can you hear?
Thank you, Tali. Can you hear me?
Thank you very much for this generous introduction. And of course, this is really an honor to be here. And as a faculty member of the Central European University, which received the political asylum in Austria, I'm especially grateful for Austria that created this continuity of work for all of us. And I'm also really looking forward to work on this new assignment, which I recently received, that I will be on the scientific advisory board of the Erinnern project, which is so important for Vienna and for Austria, teaching and rethinking the memory and the history of the Holocaust for secondary level education in Austria. And when Tali sent me this invitation, I immediately accepted, because working with Tali is always really fun, because she's one of the few historians who recognizes the urgency to think through the past with the questions of today. So I actually wrote up my contributions just to make sure that I have got in these 15 minutes. So if you can show the PowerPoint, then you would not see me in full screen, but a very simple PowerPoint, which is explaining what I would like to do today here. So it is not enough to be brave, but one needs to win the fight against forgetting. Agency is the first step. I use the concept of agency according to Sabah Mahmood, for whom agency is, I quote, a capacity for action that historically specific relations of subordination enable and create, end quote. But being remembered as brave and an original woman is another issue. And this is not always easy. One might think that the protagonist of the story I'm presenting here today had a good chance to win this fight for remembrance. Hanna Szenes, Anikó Szenes, was born 100 years ago this year on the 17th of July, 1921 in Budapest. And that is the reason I'm presenting her story here today, because I wanted to use the opportunity to remember and commemorate her. One would think that someone who is a national hero of Israel, who is called the Jewish Joan of Arc, and compared to Anna Frank, who has left behind a significant literary oeuvre translated into more than 50 languages, would successfully fight the historical oblivion that so often befalls women who perform historical deeds. And she may even avoid becoming an empty and canonized symbol. However, Anikó, Hanna Szenes could not avoid the intersection of interconnected and mutually constitutive circles of forgetting. This resulted in a canonized history of her life, highlighting different elements of her life in different periods, by at the same time omitting other elements. These circles of forgetting have condemned her to oblivion in Hungary, in her native land, where she spent 19 years of her 20 years long life. These different circles of memory are made up of much debated key elements of the 20th century Hungarian, European, Israeli history, which intersected precisely in narrating of her life story. For all women in the past, the question is who and how they are remembered, represented, spoken about, or perhaps spoken instead of. And also how official memory selects the elements from her life story that is considered to be worth remembering from a political point of view. There are several circles of memory which are interconnected in her 20-year-long life story. After the death of Hanna Szenes, the memory circles of the same life story in Israel and Hungary are fundamentally different. The circles of memory, which in Israel had turned the cult of Anikó Szenes into a political religion, in Hungary moved into the opposite direction towards forgetting, till this present illiberal turn, then with the help of the international network of the Hasidic sect, the Chabad, the 100th anniversary is used to revive selected elements of her life story. So the first circle of questions concern the history of the Hungarian Jewry before the Shoah. How can the history of the assimilation trap of Hungarian Jewry be assessed? The research on moral issues of the Hungarian Jewry's resistance and attempt at self-rescue during the Shoah, including the Kastner train, which are tragically linked to Szenes military vision, took place at the same time, has just started. Especially in the present illiberal memory turn, when the government of Hungary again chooses which Jewish community they consider the authentic representative of the second largest Jewish community in the continent. The second circle of memory of Hannah Szenes is related to the position of women within the Palestinian Jewish population that was forged into a community in the Yishuv, where the contrast between the egalitarian ideology and the reality experienced there gave rise to much conflict, frustration, and disunity. This has been researched especially by Judy Baumer-Schwartz, and I'm not wasting time on this. The third set of memories is the story of the military mission planned by the British Secret Service and its assessment, influenced by the Cold War and the memory of the Cold War. And the fourth one is, of course, the politics of the Hungarian memory after 1945, which is where the resistance of a female hero, especially a British intelligence officer, does not fit into the canon. It is especially incongruous that the resisting officer was a Hungarian Jewish girl whose patriotism and admiration for the 19th century romantic Hungarian authors raises many sensitive questions. And adding to this, the influence of the Sovietized party state, communist state ruthlessly oppressed Zionism in Hungary after 1945. So in this brief paper, I'm focusing on the Hungarian part of the story of memorialization, where she spent 19 years of her life. And this study explores the paradoxes of her memory, how circles of memory are linked in case of Cold War, legal memory, the class struggle, and Zionism, all contributing to forgetting, which means that agency is not enough. So the early years, the English connection and the body politics. The memorialization of Hannah Szenes started very early. It was already on the 3rd of May, 1945, when the guns were still thundering in Berlin, when the British representation of the Allied-controlled committee in Budapest formally approached the Ministry of Defense, asking the Council of Ministers to promote Etelka Szenes, mistakenly misspelled, to the rank of a reserve captain in recognition of her work for Hungary. The proposal was stalled because such a rank did not exist in the Hungarian army, and also the second proposal was stalled. On the 25th of October 1949, the dossier was closed, saying that the issue was no longer timely. Indeed, it was not. As a member of the British intelligence service resisting Nazism made Szenes a suspect in Cold War Hungary, which obviously did not remain undetected by the communist police. Her tomb also had an adventurous story. In 1946, in Hungary, a 2-meter high white tombstone designed by a well-known artist was erected over his tomb. The Jewish cemetery, in the Jewish cemetery, which was exhumed and transported to Israel in 1950. So far, I haven't found the documents how this happened, but this is an interesting story in itself. Due to the neglect of the cemetery, this 2-meter high white tombstone was transported to Israel in 2007 at the initiative of the nephew and the mother, where it was placed close to the Szenes Hannah Memorial House. which has got more than 15,000 pilgrims every year. Chhange was not lucky on the field of legal memory either. Chhange's mother held the military judge personally responsible for her daughter's death and reported him to the people's tribunals. The judge, Simon was his name, was arrested on the 8th of December 1945. His trial began in 1946 and dragged on until 1947 because all the original materials of the trial in 1944 could not be found. It is assumed that this judge had the foresight to destroy them himself. The trial examined whether the judge advocate had acted in accordance with regulations on the 7th of November 1944, when the Soviet troops were already approaching Budapest. Simon, this judge, had the good common sense to leave the country silently in 1946, and he was never heard from again. In his absence, he was sentenced to 1 year in prison and 5 years deprivation of political rights for crimes against people. Sorry, 3 years of prison. But because he left, the attempt of Chhange's mother to create a big trial delivering justice in Hungary, where her beloved daughter was executed, failed. After the communist takeover in Hungary in 1948, the memory of Chhange was placed in the intersection of different powerful forces, all contributed to the silence around her. First, she became a victim of class struggle. The story of the Chhange family is a story of assimilated middle-class Jewish family that grew quietly and reliably in the bourgeois assimilation. After 1945, the middle class and the bourgeois as categories became targets, and Béla Chhange, the father, who was a well-known cabaret writer, became suspicious and the representative of the old regime, and also the family was labeled as who belonged to the previous regime. Hannah Chhange's relationship to Zionism was also ambiguous. For her mother, a strong believer in promise of assimilation, who had been dedicated an entry in the Hungarian women's lexicon on her own right using her married name, an utopian class warrior radicalism of left-wing Zionism was very alarming. She obviously imagined a future for her daughter similar to her own, an educated, skilled wife raising her children at home with a well-paid husband at the back. She did not realize till it was too late that this career model for Jewish women in Hungary was no longer a realistic option. The Zionist ideas of Hannah Chhange were intersecting with the Hungarian 19th century romantic ideas in her work. The style of Anikó Chhange's diary takes a complete turn in autumn 1938, when she deliberately and explicitly refers to István Széchenyi's diary, who is the greatest Hungarian, who is from the 19th century romantic age, fighting against the Habsburgs, which has got a particular resonance here. The parallel is also noteworthy in the context of Széchenyi's political role, because Széchenyi helped to create the modern Hungary and was a symbolic figure for Anikó Chhange in the creation of the State of Israel, and Széchenyi's style had a great influence on her. Her views were particularly influenced by the Hungarian classics of the 19th century, written for the improvement of national feelings. And Anikó, strangely enough for today, on her holidays into the Tatra Mountains, carved Great Hungary, no, no, never, on a bench, which shows that she identified with the general ideology of the time, opposing the Paris Peace Treaty and demanded revisionism. It is not a coincidence that she sought to associate with not with the illegal communists, but the radical Haluc movement, like many of her lower middle class and middle class peers during dissimilation. Thus, she became into conflict with the Jewish establishment of older men. The Haluc utopian egalitarian movement gave her life, meaning, and belonging, neither of which she found in the midst of the increasing persecution of Jews in place where her Hungarian contemporaries did. Later, in 1945, her story was published in the Halutz edition with the title Mission and Death of Anna Senes, to inspire the revival of the Zionist movement in Hungary, which was then gaining the attention of the political police under communist control. The cult of a woman with an independent ideas and considerable life, despite her young age, would have threatened the cult of a communist martyr of Anna Koltói, a worker of a working class origin who was executed in the same prison as Senes. During the anti-Zionist campaign and persecution policies of the entire Soviet bloc, Senes' Zionism was forgotten and not celebrated, as it was in Israel. And after 1989, she was again the missing heroine. There was not an agent who could stand behind the memorialization of Senes in Hungary. So again, agency is not enough. You need agents who are promoting the stories. The first missing agent of memorialization was the tolerant Lutheran Church. As Anikó Senes was studying in this elite Lutheran secondary school, she had cultural capital she received from home. She skated, went to theater, concert, museums, learned languages. But in this particular Lutheran school, she faced several failures. First of all, her appearance was particularly important for an adolescent girl, and she was very much hurt that she was not in the center of the attention because she was not considered at that time pretty. Second, her literary talent was not recognized because she and Ágnes Nemes Nagy, who was one of the greatest Hungarian poets, attended the same literary circle. And of course, Ágnes Nemes Nagy was getting all the attention and not she, who was Jewish. And the third is that she achieved very quickly the glass ceiling in this reformed school, and she was not given any recognition and tasks in the student circle. So she could not have been memorialized by this by the Protestants. So after 1989, after the fall of communism, Anikó Senes' memory did find some outlet in a wider public sphere. The first step was publishing Hannah Senes' diary, which was published in Israel in 1954. And it was not published in Hungary until 1991. And in 1993, the Military Council of the Metropolitan Court of Budapest annulled the verdict which sentenced her to death. Also, some memorial plaques were set up in the Jewish Museum of the Dohány Street Synagogue, and also in 2015, a Senes Hanna Park has been established. There was a film, also an oratorium, which were written about her. Even this process of remembrance, which took a long time, could not have been called a broad process, and even provoked the anger of journalists of the far right Hungarian political spectrum. And in 2001, this newspaper published, the Hungarian Forum, a long article about Hannah Senes as an I quote, an anti-Hungarian Zionist subversive, end quote. Otherwise, the history has not been kind to Anikó Senes' multi-layered memory in Hungary at all. In the dominant post-1989 anti-communist discourse, a committed left-wing anti-fascist resistance fighter did not fit in any way, especially not a Jew, and certainly not an armed woman of resistance. The Hungarian Jewish organizations did not fully engage in safeguarding Senes' memory, and for the majority of the Jews in Hungary, she was too militant, too young, too Zionist, and by the way, a woman. For the reformists, she was too Zionist. For the Orthodox, she was above all a woman and too Hungarian. Too left-wing for the right-wing Zionists, and too middle class and classically educated for the left-wing. The Hungarian women's movement in Hungary, which was gaining strength after 1989, was already critical of the Israeli domestic policies, of which Chhange was the official hero, and failed to find possible links with the life of a woman of considerable political and artistic creativity, who successfully rebelled against religious and institutionalized male religious and political authority. Chhange also did not come out of the post-1989 Americanization of the Holocaust memory either, in a good way, as she did not represent the classical type of the survivor, who either died in a concentration camp or found a new home in the US. She did not become a part of that canon either. Due to the lack of institutionalized remembrance in Hungary, the privatized Holocaust memory business had an impact on her memory. In 2018, a so-called Showa Bunker Museum opened in the Veselényi Street in the center of the Jewish district, not far away from the Dohai synagogue. The private initiative claimed to present Hannah Chhange's life with original documents from Eichmann's bunker, never seen anywhere else, for a bargain price of €7. The site and the collection, of course, had nothing to do with Chhange nor with Eichmann, but aimed at the uninformed foreign tourists, mostly from Israel and US, using her name as a bite. It took the protest of memory activists and NGO activists who actually took the street to protest against this museum to close down the business venture built on Hannah Chhange's reputation, which was impossible to close down without that particular protest, as the district authorities nor the state had any jurisdiction over a private museum. A small, brave private initiative like this protest can make the difference. And Kodolko erected the justly famous mini statue of Hannah Chhange you see on the screen, who was about to parachute on the Women's Day of 2020, bringing this tragic story closer and humanizing it. And if all goes well, the municipality of Budapest, the second district, plans to erect a public statue of her historical figure made by a female artist. Perhaps the memorial circles of the important women heroes of history can come together in such a way that a life story can inspire and sensitize generations in the future. And maybe after a heroic life and a fantastic over, a solid remembrance of Hannah Chhange will be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Andrea. Wow, what a tour de force of the memory and forgetting of this heroine to some and one to forget for others. And we will talk more about that in the Q&A. It is now my pleasure to invite our second panelist, our friend that spoke a few times already at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, appears in a podcast, and is an expert on women and the genocide in Rwanda, Dr. Sara E. Brown. Dr. Sara Brown is the executive director of Chhange, the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education in New Jersey. She holds the first PhD in comparative genocide studies from Clark University and serves on the advisory board for the International Association of Genocide Scholars. By the way, the IAGS conference is taking place online this week, and Dr. Brown is playing a huge role in this conference. Dr. Brown has worked and conducted research in Rwanda since 2004, worked in refugee camps in Tanzania and in Texas, from all places, with the refugee problem there, and researched conflict globalization and conflict in Israel. And Dr. Brown also worked at the USC Showa Foundation before she took on the baton of director of Chhange. Sara, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tali. I always love coming and speaking with your audiences, and I love the Q&A sessions because they're often so engaging. Thank you also to the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation and the Austrian Embassy of Pretoria for making today's session and this entire series possible. Thank you also to my co-panelists for joining me for these important discussions. Lieselotte Meyer was the personal secretary and mistress of the Nazi district commissar of Lida in Belarus. During the work week, she took notes at meetings, typed up orders, managed logistics, and accompanied her boss on trips to the Jewish ghetto. All of this was done with one explicit purpose: to make the region Judenfrei, free of Jews. She exercised considerable control. The district commissar's stamp sat in her office drawer, enabling her to sign for massacres and deportations on his behalf. Now on the weekends, she lounged in their villa, served by Jewish slave laborers, and accompanied her boss and also lover on hunting trips where they would hunt animals and Jews with equal fervor and enthusiasm. On another continent, and decades later, Suzanne was 83 years old when I interviewed her at a camp for genocide perpetrators in Western Rwanda. A farmer by trade with limited education, she lived with her husband, daughter, and 2 grandchildren when the genocide reached her home in West Central Rwanda. When I asked her how she came to be incarcerated, she clutched at her white rosary beads in both of her hands, and her tone was very matter-of-fact, even a bit sweet. The reason why I'm here is because I'm accused. I actually killed my grandson, one of my grandkids during the war. That's why I came here. So I began an article I published in 2020 and in which I presented a comparative study of women's actions and agencies during genocide, examining women perpetrators of the Holocaust and women perpetrators of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. Foregrounding women's experiences of genocide, I examined the impact of deeply entrenched patriarchal systems on women who ended up exercising considerable agency to become perpetrators in Nazi Germany and 1994 Rwanda. Now, despite noticeable differences in time, place, context, culture, there are many differences. Similarities persist between the 2 case studies. And when examined in a comparative lens, they offer unique insights into the gendered nature of women's participation in mass violence. So I set about comparing existing research about Nazi women during the Holocaust with oral testimonies that I collected and analyzed from women in Rwanda. And I found that a relaxing of sorts of the patriarchal order facilitated women's participation in both instances of genocide. Now, this may seem shocking to some. It's actually not unusual. While I am not going to delve into the particulars of many of these similarities that exist between women perpetrators of the Holocaust and the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, including their gendered mobilization pre-genocide, constrained spaces for participation during the genocide, and their invisibility in large part post-genocide, I do want to stress these similarities in this introduction in order to make the following point. Women's participation in the perpetration of the Holocaust is not anomalous, nor is it monstrous, though popular narratives and even some scholarship would have us believe so. While a deeply entrenched patriarchal system existed in pre-World War II Germany and constrained women's agency throughout the Holocaust, women were subjected to gendered mobilization before the Holocaust, notably relaxed social structures that facilitated their participation during the Holocaust, and a prevailing silence and invisibility after the Holocaust. Now, although Victoria Barnett quite correctly argues that social and political factors may shape individual behavior, but ultimately it is the individual who decides what is moral and acts accordingly, measures implemented and enacted by the Third Reich facilitated women's participation in the Holocaust. Their participation was a result of a deliberate and gendered mobilization that specifically targeted women in Germany and encouraged them to become functionaries of genocide. Even in pre-1933 Germany, despite promises of equality and gender inclusion under the Weimar Republic, women did not enjoy the same access to economic opportunities, political representation, and education as men. So even as the Nazi Party in the very early days preached a brand of race-based hatred, prejudice, and discrimination. It promised certain women reforms that would liberate them. Now, throughout the 1920s and after they came to power in 1933, the Nazis encouraged and later on required in certain instances that girls and women join in sex-specific Nazi organizations, including the National Socialist Women's League and the League of German Girls. These groups offered new avenues for women to engage in activism and provided an acceptable space in which they could occupy leadership positions and wield influence. This was attractive to them. It also provided a space for sex-specific political indoctrination and racist propaganda. Women were also recruited into the workforce. Some women joined Nazi efforts because of the social and economic opportunities it afforded. Especially after the invasion of Poland in September 1939, the Third Reich recruited unmarried women as teachers, secretaries, and nurses, offering them previously unthinkable opportunities for travel, work, adventure. These positions also provided women with a socially acceptable escape from village life, early marriage, or other gender-restrictive mores of German patriarchy. Also important, positions in the Nazi genocide machine offered an opportunity to exercise power. For example, as labor and concentration camps became more permanent and widespread and the number of women prisoners increased, women guards were recruited, initially through the National Socialist Women's League, and later through vaguely worded newspaper advertisements and word-of-mouth referrals. But even as German women were afforded some real estate in the public and political spheres, the positions they could occupy and how far they could advance remained tightly controlled. This was consistent with Nazi ideology and practice. The Nazi Party promoted a rigid set of gender norms that harkened back to the children, kitchen, church policies of the German Empire, enacting a series of measures that even codified women's domesticity and motherhood, including the law for the encouragement of marriage and the cross of honor for the German mother. In addition, manipulation of German history helped to further limit the role of women to homemaker, wife, mother, and glorified that return as a return to domesticity as a return to tradition. So while on the one hand, there is this relaxation of certain boundaries that had previously restricted women's participation and promises of further liberation and reform, there still existed a repressive system that controlled women. And this push-pull, at once liberating women and constraining them, this was a recurring theme of the Third Reich. Even their body positive approach, which on the face of it, encouraging women to forego cosmetics and artificial beauty enhancements, which would seem pro-women, it was part of an effort to control German women's exposure to Western modernity. In addition, gendered fear-mongering also manipulated women, harnessing the latest technology and mainstream means of communication available at the time and deployed to stir up fear in the population with deadly effect. As the Nazi propaganda machine gained control throughout Germany and later in Nazi-occupied Europe, cartoon images, printed pieces, and cinema played up the threat of Jewish antagonists with great drama. Manipulating an exclusionary us versus them mentality further played upon the rising fear and uncertainty of the 1930s and further mobilized German women to eventually participate in the Holocaust. Now, the trouble with focusing on well-known women perpetrators like Ilse Koch, the wife of the commandant of Buchenwald, she's well known for her sadism and other eccentricities. The problem is that we may wrongly think of her and others like her as deviant anomalies, rather than an illustration of women's capacity to perpetrate genocide. She's unique only because of the power that she wielded. Falling into such mental ruts costs us an opportunity to examine what half of the population was doing, and it also renders them invisible when exploring the broader narrative of what happened during the Holocaust. Tens of thousands of ordinary women participated in the Holocaust, from typing orders to accompanying military units that massacred Jews to staffing the concentration camps. And an estimated 12 million women worked in various bureaucratic capacities for National Socialist organizations that buttressed that genocidal regime. Now, Wendy Lauer notes that women played a role in the Holocaust, not at the helm, but as the machine's operatives. Women witnesses were present at sites of killing, and they did nothing, and they said nothing. They were complicit by attrition. Their silence was a decision in and of itself, a choice, and it served as a seal of approval. Others served as accomplices in the crimes perpetrated, including providing support for an array of genocidal bureaucrats, aware of but numb or removed from the human impact of their work, as well as those who cheered on killing mobs, supported ghetto liquidations, or looted Jewish belongings at train centers. Actual murderers included nurses who worked at the Nazi euthanasia program, camp guards, wives and mistresses of camp staff who joined in mass murder, land managers who were in charge of slave laborers, and women who seized or facilitated other opportunities to kill. Their roles were complex and their crimes multifarious. Going back to the example of Lieselotte Meyer, she occupied multiple categories here. She was an accomplice. She served as secretary and lover to the district commissar of Lida and oversaw those bureaucratic processes that underpinned the mass murder of Jews in that region. But she was also a murderer, planning massacres, participating in mass shootings, and joining hunts that often targeted Jews. Women's crimes during the Holocaust are well documented, but for many, including survivors who witnessed it firsthand, it is often difficult to make sense of the ordinary, and I say ordinary because we're talking with big quotes around it, because we're talking about the context of an utterly extraordinary situation, which is genocide, but ordinary crimes perpetrated by these ordinary women. Unfortunately, this difficulty to grasp the complexity and scope of their crimes often contributes to their invisibility post-genocide and within the meta-narrative of the Holocaust. When examining the history of the Holocaust, a gendered lens persists, and it makes examination and comprehension of women's participation in the actual genocide very difficult. Now, this extends into and beyond scholarship, and it also impacts post-genocide narratives. As I just noted, even the survivor community can struggle with this and making sense of women's participation. I want to note also here that this is the same, I've encountered the same difficulty to grasp that narrative, to understand it, even as they witnessed it among survivors of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. Now, though the crimes of Nazi women are documented, the international court system was blinded by imposed gender roles. They were unable to comprehend the agency that the Third Reich did provide women. Now, as a result, the widely cited Nuremberg trials, they focus solely on men perpetrators and also at the highest tiers of decision-making. They exempted from indictment mid and lower level bureaucrats and functionaries, including clerks, secretaries, stenographers, cleaning staff, and other low-level support staff. And this benefited those women functionaries of the Holocaust. Other mechanisms that were put in place to try suspected perpetrators of the Holocaust, including the denazification courts, they tended to overlook women. Lauer found that in both Germany and in Austria, while some women were defendants in post-war investigations and trials, they were very much in the minority, and these efforts were largely inconsistent. East Germany ended up seeing the largest number of trials, where 220 women faced trial between 1945 and 1990. Now compare that to the tens of thousands I mentioned earlier and the upwards of 12 million who participated in the various organizations that buttress the genocidal regime. It's a very small number. Now, those women who did face trial were routinely sensationalized. They were framed as sadistic, inhuman others, or more often as maternal emotional innocents. But with these gendered nicknames like the bitch of Buchenwald or the mayor of Majdanek, convicted women perpetrators were often dismissed as inhuman aberrations rather than members of the mainstream social movement that was state-sponsored genocide. Now, it's difficult to estimate the total number of women perpetrators of the Holocaust. Still, it is evident that the majority did not face justice. They benefited from those few post-war trials, but it's also a result of women's efforts to deny their participation, obfuscate their role, and evade justice. Holocaust survivor Elizabeth Berkovich actually recalls the change in tone that was adopted by her women captors as the Allied forces advanced through Nazi-occupied Europe. They would remind her repeatedly to remember how good I was to you when the Americans come. These women were fearful of justice, and they likely navigated this new post-war space as deftly as they had during the Holocaust, this time manipulating gendered assumptions about women's passivity and capacity for deadly action to their benefit. Just in brief conclusion, I want to note that women have participated in acts of mass violence throughout history, including the Holocaust. And I have found, both in my work in Rwanda, looking at women perpetrators of the genocide against the Tutsi, as well as this research I did about women perpetrators of the Holocaust, I keep finding that whenever we dismiss women perpetrators as inhuman others, we ignore their participation, or we focus solely on the women who were victimized or stood by, we lose this opportunity to more fully understand how and why genocide occurs. And with that understanding, how best to prevent or stop it. Women's participation in mass violence, like the Holocaust, constitutes a key piece of the whole story of mass violence and the whole story of what happened during the Holocaust. Though fewer in number than the men who acted during the genocide and subsequently overlooked within German society and beyond for more than 70 years, these women perpetrators should not, and cannot be underestimated or ignored. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. Wow. Again, a very powerful look at this time perpetrators, a little look at Rwanda, but a proper look at the Holocaust. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Finally, we are going to hear from Professor Avihu Ronen, who is a retired professor at Tel Chai Academic College and University of Haifa. And he is the second son of the late Chaika Klinger, an activist of the Jewish underground in Poland during World War II. And he published much about this subject of resistance. Sadly, Professor Ronen had a family crisis. So what I will do is I'm going to share with you his PowerPoint presentation and present to you his topic, Women as Leaders in the Jewish Underground in Poland during the Holocaust. The presence of so many young women in the Jewish underground leadership and their unique role within this leadership are unusual phenomena, not only against the background of a pre-feminist era, but even in the comparison with social and political organizations today. In fact, in almost every underground leadership in the Polish ghettos, one can find one or more dominant feminine figures. Tzivia Lubetkin and Tosha Altman in Warsaw, Chaika Grossman in Bialystok, Mire Gola in Krakow. Women also had leading roles in rescue underground organization. Hansi Brand in Hungary or Gizi Fleischmann in Slovakia. All of these women were active members of the leadership, had a significant influence on the decision-making processes, and were at times leading figures in resistance operations. In short, they were leaders. The roots of this unique phenomenon can be found in two overlapping traditions, respectively that of revolutionary Europe and that of the Jewish youth movements. In the second half of the 19th century, women held leading position in revolutionary movements. Rosa Luxemburg in the German social democracy movement and Emma Goldman, the American anarchist. These women were able to emerge as leaders because of their egalitarian and anarchist characteristics of their respective movements, in which women were truly considered equal to men. The Jewish youth movements had their own values and norms, which devised a new social position for Jewish girls. Most of the movements were radical socialist or bore the impact of socialism in one way or another. The equality of women within the social framework was taken for granted, since it derived from the idea of equality among all human beings. In this new social context, the girls had some advantages over the boys. Most of the youth movement members were under 18 years old. In such groups, the level of maturity of the girls was clearly superior to that of the boys, with the result that the girls naturally assumed key roles. In consequence, many young women later advanced to central positions in the movement leadership. In addition, the youth movement groups functions like a family, which its members related to each other as brothers and sisters, and to the male and female youth leaders as father and mother, respectively. These characteristics of the Jewish youth movements, together with the tradition of the revolutionary woman, were transferred to the Jewish youth organizations during the Holocaust. The Jewish youth movements continued most of the unique activities during the first period of World War II between 1939 and 1942. They appear to have been strong and effective, better adapted to the new reality of the ghettos than adult organizations. In some of the ghettos, the overall activity flourished, sometimes even exceeding that of the pre-war period. The role of women in this activity was significant from the very first days of the war and the German occupation. Just before the war, some movements established an alternative leadership, comprised mostly of women, in case the male leaders were conscripted to the Polish army. Although these alternative leadership functioned only partially in the first chaotic months of the occupation, the promotion of women into leading roles soon became evident. The first delegates to the German-occupied area of Poland from Vienna and Russian-occupied Poland were women, Frunka Plodnitsky, Zivia Lubetkin, and Tosha Altman. During this period, 1940 to 1942, many branches of the youth movements were led by women, or included women or girls in the local and central leadership. Indeed, not a single ghetto leadership lacked at least one influential woman. The ongoing occupation and the ghettos necessitated the creation of a new function, an emissary or delegate, shaliach, of the central leadership. This function was fulfilled mainly by females because of the danger of the circumcision test at German checkpoints. However, the delegates of the central movement who traveled illegally from ghetto to ghetto were not mere male carriers delivering messages and underground press from Warsaw to the provinces. They had to remain at the destination for several days or weeks in order to discuss ideological and educational matters with the local leadership, oversee local educational activity, plan and lead theoretical seminars for the older members of the branch, etc. In short, they had to personally represent the central leadership, its ideas, programs, and organizations. The shaliach functions much more like a high-ranking staff officer in a military organization than as an underground courier. All of them were in leading positions in their movements and acted as authorized representatives of the central leadership. When it came to fighting, it appears that the new leadership of women was somewhat reduced. They left the combat to the men and were relegated to auxiliary duties such as communications, logistics, first aid, documentations, etc. However, although there was some change in gender status during the days of the armed underground and the fighting between 42 and 44, women's role and status remained significant. Although men occupied most of the command, in several cases, women did serve as commanders. Roska Korczak as the commander of an important position in the Wilden ghetto. Witka Kempener-Kovner led small units on railway sabotage operations in the Vilna ghetto and the forests. And Zivia Lubetkin led the escape through the sewers from the burning Warsaw ghetto. In many of the underground fighting units, there were women as courageous and daring as the men, and sometimes even more so. Furthermore, women leaders continued in some important functions from the earlier period. Now more than ever, the fighting organization needed them as delegate couriers to deliver arms and military instructions from ghetto to ghetto. Young women such as Renia Kukilka traveled from Warsaw to Begin, Fredka Oxenhandler from Sosnowiec to Krakow, and many other delegates couriers traveled with forged documents, revolvers, ammunition, and instructions hidden in their clothing. These girls had not previously belonged to the leadership, but their courage and the importance of their missions made them equal partners with their leaders. Because of their moral and ideological authority, women also proved vital during the days of preparations for the final battles. In several cases, the women were more firm and determined in crisis situations. They were constant in their adherence to the idea of Jewish resistance, morally supporting the fighters, mourning the dead, and encouraging the fighting. For many of their comrades, they symbolize the spirit of the Jewish uprising. Perhaps the most interesting characteristics of women leaders in the Jewish underground during the preparations and the battles was the dual leadership, composed of one man and one woman, emerged in many of the Jewish undergrounds in the ghettos. The main reason for this development lay in the family structure of the intimate group in which the male and female youth leaders were viewed by the youngsters as the group's father and mother. During the war, there was an additional reason, though, and that is romance. The leaders of the youth movements during the war were young people in their 20s, and under normal circumstances, they were supposed to immigrate to Eretz Israel and establish kibbutzim. But most of them were also planning to marry and raise families, but immigration was postponed because of the war, and they were confined in the ghettos, occupied with their new missions. They simply needed to love and be loved, and the persons most available and attracted to them were their comrades in the youth movement leadership. Love affairs between the youth movement leaders were quite common in the Polish ghettos. The most famous were Yitzhak Antek-Zuckerman and Tzivia Lubetkin in Warsaw, Gusta Davidson and Shimshon Dragner in Krakow, Witka Kempner and Abba Kovner in Vilna, and Chaika Klinger and David Kozlowski in Begin. And of course, Chaika is Professor Ronen's mother. These couples supported each other on both the collective and personal levels, frequently sharing responsibilities during the days of the underground. Although the man was usually considered to be representative leader, in practice, the woman sometimes became the actual leader. So though there was no clear distribution of power and responsibility between the two, it seems that the man functioned as the mission-orientated leader and the woman as the people-orientated leader. The women leaders represented the moral and ideological cause of the uprising. They were most instrumental in keeping the social cohesion of the underground groups. Rather more, it seems that they were more qualified to face death situations and presented high mental resilience. None of them, like Chaika Klinger or Renia Kukelka, were broken in interrogations and tortures. In other cases, the women were considered more as the leader's girl than as leaders per se. However, even these women were not passive assistants to their partners, but rather their equal partners in special missions and their paramount supporters in dark times. In some of the dual leadership, the women and the men both perished. In one case, that of Gusta Davidson and Shimshon Drenger in 1943, this was the fulfillment of a secret contract between the two. She surrendered to the Germans when she heard that Shimshon had been captured. In two cases, Antek Zuckerman and Tzivia Lubetkin, and Neska Schendel and Tzvi Gold, both parties survived to lead a happy life in Israel. But in most of the cases, only the women survived, and in their memoirs, they focused on the story of their dead comrades. The first historiography of the Jewish uprising was, the first historiography of the Jewish uprising was written by women who tended to minimize their own role in the events and to emphasize that played by their partner, mainly of their dead lover leader. The later historiography was written by men, and again, the role of the woman was reduced. It seems that the time has come to give the woman their due. So now it is time to open the floor in the last 20 minutes to your thoughts and comments. Let me see if anyone already posted some of their thoughts. And can I ask our hosts to put Andrea and Sara together with me in the middle. And Harry Sneyman is asking, thanks for the reference. I'm interested in what Rothbard calls the implicated subject, and I try to develop from that hermeneutic of vulnerability I can use from the perspective of whiteness in a post-apartheid society. And I wonder, Sara and Andrea, if you have any comments about that. And let us also go with Jill Murray. In these contexts, it is interesting to think of the emerging agency of Winnie Mandela in South Africa for good and less good. And Sara, if you can, would you comment? And not only about Winnie, but other leaders in the South African context and maybe African contexts like Rwanda. So maybe Sara, you can start. Andrea, I also have one question privately to you, and that is about forgetting in Hungary. You spoke about Senes, where others forgotten, for example, Raoul Wallenberg or Karl Lutz.
I feel a bit more comfortable speaking in broader terms about women's agency and also how women are received. I know Winnie Mandela is a complicated character in South Africa, and I'm not even going to pretend to be an expert. But I do remember exploring the complicated narrative of her developing into this leadership position, not necessarily by choice, but because her husband was incarcerated and she was given this almost the mantle to carry on while he was incarcerated, and recalling some of the more complicated aspects of how she exercised that agency in very a lot of the negative has certainly been highlighted. I do sometimes wonder, though, what it was like from her personal perspective to be such a young woman, all of a sudden tasked with carrying on a movement in the name of a husband she barely knew, who was much older than her, and how she carried on that mantle for so many years, and then being expected to kind of return into almost a prescribed and proscribed, highly gendered role once her spouse was freed and resumed this tremendous and inspiring leadership position. There's no easy way to talk about her or to talk about women who, when women are exercising agency during periods of mass violence, mass atrocities, apartheid could be certainly counted in there. I think that there is a relaxing of certain social structures, in part because the social structures have collapsed. They've fallen apart. They are failing people. The social fabric that holds us together, and often woven into it, are those gendered roles and norms. It's tearing apart during those times. Now, in the post-conflict context, oftentimes you see communities trying to go back to previous mores and norms and those prescribed behaviors. I want to note that Rwanda was extremely unique in that they did not do that, and it was to their credit that they decided to push forward this idea of gender mainstreaming, and I'm sure many people here know, became the first country in the world to elect a women's majority parliament, and they've done so since several times. It's no longer news in Rwanda, though it's news everywhere else in the world. And so there's something to be said about taking a lesson of perhaps we should empower and engage with that 50% of the population and allow them access to political and social spaces as equal to men. Maybe that actually contributes to long-term post-genocide stability and growth. I would argue that Rwanda is a case study in which we could argue effectively for yes.
Andrea.
Thank you very much for the questions. And first, I would like to respond to a question where I've got limited expertise, namely the issue of Rwanda, because I think what I learned from the different, I supervised a PhD thesis about Rwanda and the women's politics in Rwanda. And of course, the PhD student knows much more about this than myself. And what I learned is that how the gender equality and gender mainstreaming was instrumentalized in order to set up an illiberal political regime in Rwanda. And that's why I would be rather careful to celebrate women's participation in a regime where women whose PhD student was interviewing were extremely careful to voice what they think and their own opinion. So I just would like to, a little bit warn us to be cautious about how these women's voices were presented, because very often this is a facade. This is just, hiding what is really behind it. So that's my view, but of course you are.
That has not been my experience, having worked and researched in Rwanda since 2004. So I want to politely and respectfully disagree with what you just said.
Okay, but what I just wanted to say is that this research, what my PhD student did, was actually proving that this political system, which was set up in Rwanda, was basically instrumentalizing and using gender politics in order to create an acceptable position of a political regime, which is very far away from being democratic. So just, let's agree to disagree. That's fine. So the other aspect, what Tali was asking, is the issue of forgetting. And I put it in the chat, this podcast I did with Aleida Esman about the 7 forces of forgetting, which I think is a very useful tool, because we did this podcast with the kind of having education in mind, because there will be a monument erected in Budapest to the victims of military rape. And there were several interviews with Michael Rothberg and James Young and others to prepare for this particular project. And I did the interview with Aleida, and in this, which is based on the book he did on the 7 ways of forgetting. And so forgetting is not necessarily bad. So there are certain moments when forgetting is necessary and sometimes even constructive. And let me give you one example from my research, which is on the rapes, the history of sexual violence during the Second World War in Hungary, that silence and forgetting can be a form of resistance. Not speaking about the crimes, not reiterating the violence which had been inflicted on women's bodies can be a form of resistance. And of course, this is the kind of Susan Sontag argument about the power of the kind of horrible images, but still, when responding to Tali's question about Wallenberg and Lutz, I mean, that is also a kind of forgetting which was constructed in the same way as the forgetting of Hanna Senes or Aniko Senes, because there are several axes, structural forgetting, structural factors which are contributed to the forgetting. So, they all go back to the Cold War. I very briefly touched upon the issue of the Cold War framework, which is discussing the issue of how the Cold War division actually made certain political actors invisible, like Lutz, who was one of the very important rescuers, or Wallenberg, who was immediately imprisoned by the Soviets and died among still unclear circumstances in the Soviet Union. And after 1989, it took some time till all this came to light and found its place in the different memorial cultures. So when we are talking about this issue of forgetting, I would also like to again underline that forgetting, based on Assmann's point, that forgetting can be also empowering. And this is also the way how certain stories are being constructed, that some parts of the stories are being forgotten and some elements are being elevated and canonized. And that's what I found when I was interviewing female perpetrators in Hungary, who were following very different and very similar patterns what Sara was describing based on the work of Wendy Lauer. So the way how they are constructing their stories is always a negotiation. It's a negotiation of different contexts, different structural factors, and who is listening, who is not listening, and who is the imagined audience. And that's why forgetting can be a constructive force of creating, in a certain sense, women's agency, which is the topic of today's conference. Thank you.
Sara, I don't know if you want to reflect a little bit more about the issue of forgetting or the issue of women perpetrators. And also Gladwin Lehman is asking, in general, those German women who were brought to trial post-war, what sentence did they receive, and did they after join normal society?
I don't want to pretend that I have exact data to cite on this one, but anecdotally, from what I read, it appears that there was a pretty high acquittal rate, or sentences were commuted. Women did not end up serving their full sentences, or they were given much lighter sentences. And by and large, and this was actually the case in Rwanda too, up to a point, women were able to rejoin society in their lives as though they had done nothing. And what's interesting about the Rwanda case is that, you know, a decade later, Gacaca, the hybrid judicial system that was established by the government there, Gacaca comes into effect, you know, initially in a pilot phase and then nationwide in 2006. And a lot of these women, in a way, they expressed to me in interviews, the incarcerated women whom I interviewed, they expressed surprise that 10 years later, someone was coming in looking for them and investigating their crimes. And in the end, you know, I believe it's 96,653 women were brought to dock of the 1,003,227 that were initially tried by the Gacaca courts over a 6-year period. That's a pretty significant percentage. So it's a little bit of a different role there, but there is a slightly higher acquittal rate also with them. And I do wonder if that is due to a gendered lens among the Inyangamugayo, the elected judges who oversaw the Gacaca process.
Yeah, they wished that they will forget, but they didn't. They came back and found them. Susan Harris is asking, what level of education did women perpetrators or women upstanders have? Did it play any role in the choices they made? Both Andrea, in your research on women, and you, Sara.
Thank you. I think this is really interesting to ask about the educational level, because that somehow assumes that only the uneducated and the kind of uninformed are, you know, doing all these crimes, but the educational level are really very different. So if you look at my book about the female perpetrators, I set up a variety of different patterns of perpetration, starting from medical doctors who thought that this anti-modernist emancipation represented by the far-right parties is the solution for the different social problems, to intellectuals like journalists who were amazed by the fascist and the Nazi example, and they wanted to have this happen also in Hungary. Also the women who were just, you know, typists and stenographers, and this was a kind of, you know, employment like, you know, any kind of employment, that it was secure, to the point when there were those so-called ordinary perpetrators, who, using Christopher Browning's term, this ordinary, who were basically using this uncertainty to enrich themselves. So the female crime was to denounce the neighbor because somebody loves the fur coat or the better apartment, and denouncing the neighbor. So this is a very gendered specific crime in the part of the world I know the best, which is the denunciation. And also there were those who were really committing crimes and killing Hungarians. I wrote this book about this forgotten massacre in 1944 in the center of Budapest, where Hungarians actually broke into the apartment of Hungarian citizens in the center of Budapest and committed horrendous crimes. And because they thought that they can get away with this. There won't be any witnesses, as we know, and there is always a witness who remains. And in this case, this witness was a very proactive, educated person who used the legal language and all possible available means to commemorate and to bring those whom he thought were responsible for the massacre to justice. So the educational level, in a sense, matters, and in a sense does not. Because if we look at the structure of violence and the opportunity frame, the education really doesn't matter, because the context matters, the ideology matters, and in a sense the form of perpetration happens because differs because you see very few women with high academic degrees killing people. And what is really the other, and I'm finished, that if you look at the Eurocross party, which is the Hungarian Nazi party, there were lots of women. In 30% of the members were women, which is really high if you take into consideration that the present Hungarian parliament consists of 9% of women. So this 30% is really high. It shows that there was an attraction of these anti-modernist revolutionary ideas. And these women who were very active in this party, and they actually took martyrdom for promoting the ideas of the Eurocross party. They were prisoned, and they still, were staunch believers in this kind of anti-modernist emancipation. Interestingly, when the Eurocross got the power on the 15th of October 1944, they withdrew. They withdrew, and they were not taking part in these events, which were very much similar to the Salo Republic. If you are not familiar with the Hungarian history so intimately, but this is like the period of the Salo Republic in Italy. So in a sense, education matters and it doesn't matter. But I would say generally that the general structures and the political frameworks matter more and influence the behavior of women in this particular context. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sara, I know we're running out of time and there are amazing comments in the chat, but maybe if you can integrate in final thoughts, also Mervyn Davidovitz, not only thinking about education, but also family origins, marginalization, abuse, to these female perpetrators. So maybe education plus family background.
So for this one, I'm actually going to lean, because there was a question about perpetrators and upstanders, I'm going to lean on my work in Rwanda, because I did interview women rescuers and women perpetrators there. And so I can speak to that comparative component. What was really interesting as a finding for me was that across the dozens of women whom I interviewed, their education levels were largely the same. There were a few who were educators or had vocational training, but generally they had gone through some sort of P1 to, really primary school education, and not much more beyond that. They were a majority Christian and they were a majority farmers. So it was really interesting to see that there wasn't some distinguishing element that made one person more likely to be a rescuer versus a perpetrator. Oftentimes the differences were the ability to think for themselves. And for some, it was the teachings of family members who had rescued in previous episodes of violence or perpetrated in previous episodes of violence. The teachings and learnings that they received from their political leaders, religious leaders, the head of the household, if they had a male head of household there. And another big finding that I found was that most of the women rescuers whom I met with and interviewed, the male head of household in 1992, Rwanda had instituted a law that legally recognized only the men as the head of household. And so they had full, just unbelievable power. Women couldn't even open bank accounts. They represented less than 5% of elected officials in parliament. It was really a tough time to be a woman in Rwanda. That the women who rescued and did so successfully, most of them, the men were out of the house, so they could make these decisions and decide to participate to the benefit of their community, I would argue. In terms of origin experience, marginalization, or abuse, I wish I could say that I could say more to that. And maybe that would make it slightly more convenient and comfortable thinking about their capacity for violence. I do want to drill down on this fact that most of the women whom I had interviewed didn't necessarily show any signs of psychopathy or prior trauma. They were largely, and I know this word gets abused, but ordinary. And so I guess I'll close on that, that important point because, and I'll say this is my closing comment. It's very important that we study the perpetrators. It's absolutely important that we learn these cautionary tales. I want to also argue that we should be learning more about the rescuers as role models whom we could and should be emulating on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And sadly, I don't have time to go into the excellent example from SWAPO, Southwest Africa, that Mary Simmons is sharing with us about women there, or Siku that is speaking about Zimbabwe and the Gukurahundi genocide that is so little spoken about and should be spoken about more. But I encourage everyone to read the excellent comments in the chat. And here now is my great pleasure to thank you, Andrea Peto and Sara Brown and Avihu Ronen, who is sadly at home in Israel and could not join us, but will hopefully listen to this recording. And to thank Johann Briger, Dr. Johann Briger, the ambassador of Austria in South Africa, for his partnership, and all at the Austrian embassy, to, of course, Heather Blumenthal and Mary Kluk, my colleagues and friends at the Cape Town and Durban Holocaust and Genocide centers, and their teams, of course, that helped, and of course the interns, to Aria, to Matthias, to Alex, the Austrian interns of the Austrian service abroad, with us for 10 months and working so beautifully. And Aria, well done for all you have done to put this series together. And of course, to all of you, thank you for joining us. And don't forget, this series is every Tuesday at 7 o'clock South African time and looks at another angle of women narratives. Next week, we will look at resistance. And with us will be Justice Albi Sex to share about South Africa. And of course, also with us will be a contribution from Austria. Please look at the program posted in your chat. Join us. Good night, good day, and we will see you soon again.